Hello and a very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. Coming up on our program this week, Joe Biden to be the 46th US president. We'll take a look at if and how he will change US policy in the Middle East. Saeb Erekat, a veteran fighter for the Palestinian cause, dies from COVID-19 aged 65. Plus, a conversation with the husband and wife duo behind Nasrin, a film that gives a voice to an Iranian human rights lawyer and activist, Nasrin Sotoudeh. But first, after a nail-biting race, the Americans have chosen their president, a decision that will not only bring about a wind of change in their country, but also impact many geopolitical pressure points. Peter O'Brien takes a look at how Joe Biden may handle a Middle East policy that has tilted dramatically.
Back in January, on a visit to Washington, Benjamin Netanyahu showered Donald Trump with gratitude.
You've been the greatest friend that Israel has had in the White House, and I think tomorrow we can continue making history.
This to a leader that made Israel one of America's top priorities abroad, recognizing Jerusalem as the country's capital, backing its settlements in the West Bank, supporting its claim over the Golan Heights, brokering normalized relations with the Arab world. Trump certainly left his mark on Israel.
Trump completely flouted international law. For me, this will be the biggest change. As opposed to Trump, Biden will want to respect international law.
With Joe Biden now elected as the US president, change may be on the horizon. As Barack Obama's vice president, he condemned Israeli settlements. And once he takes the reins, he's expected to open diplomatic doors to Palestinians that had been closed by Trump. He was also an advocate of the Iran nuclear deal, clinched in 2015. Under the agreement, Iran scaled back its nuclear program in return for lifted sanctions. Netanyahu calls it a capitulation. So Trump pulled out of the accord in 2018, a move Biden might try to reverse, worrying Israeli officials.
We must ensure and demand that the United States, even if it were to return, enforces it and implements it, because we know that there have been grave gaps between what is reported by Iran and what actually happens on the ground.
Among some Iranian officials, Biden's win sparked cautious optimism.
There is still time for the U.S. to come back from the wrong route they've taken. We will closely be watching words and actions from the upcoming U.S. administration.
Biden sees a return to the nuclear deal as just the first step before fresh negotiations. But one thing is clear. The president-elect, a self-described Zionist and friend to several Israeli prime ministers past and present, will not give up his country's close relationship with Israel.
Now, Saeb Erekat, a veteran negotiator, has died from COVID-19. The 65-year-old witnessed tumultuous events from an early age, becoming one of Palestine's most recognizable faces. He tirelessly advocated for a two-state solution to the decades-old conflict with Israel, and so Palestinians have declared 3 days of mourning.
A towering figure well known to international audiences, Saeb Erekat was described as an eloquent champion of the Palestinian cause. Born in Jerusalem in 1955, he received his higher education in the United States before completing a PhD in peace studies in England in 1983. Saeb Erekat led Palestinian negotiations for decades and was chief negotiator during the Oslo Accords and the Camp David Summit in 2000. He was always in pursuit of peace and yet wasn't afraid to call out Israel for what he viewed as aggressive behavior.
Israel must understand that the language of occupation, the language of the continuation of the settlement activities, the language of confiscation of land, non-compliance with agreements signed, the language that Israel is using, whether it's through attacks and through siege and through the escalation of the aggression, is not going to get us anywhere.
Saeb Erekat was known as a Yasser Arafat loyalist. He didn't view his passing as a roadblock to peace, although he was pained by his death.
My heart is broken because President Arafat is dead and the Israeli occupation has not.
In recent years, Saeb Erekat had maintained the title of chief negotiator, even though peace negotiations with Israel had stalled. He described the normalization of ties between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Israel as a poison dagger which would achieve very little.
Israel can bring 193 ambassadors to Tel Aviv. But then what? I am what needs to be solved. I am the problem. They are my problem. I am what needs to be solved. And the only way to have peace in this region is to solve the Palestinian question, is to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Despite the shifting alliances in the Middle East, Saeb Erekat always wanted to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a two-state solution based on borders negotiated to in 1967.
Now to a woman who's become a household name, not just in Iran, but also across the globe. Nasrin Sotoudeh is a women's rights attorney and the winner of the prestigious Sakharov Prize. Over the years, she's become a voice for the voiceless, also representing children, Iran's persecuted minority communities, as well as leading opponents of the death penalty. Back in 2019, the 57-year-old was arrested again for defending women who'd removed their hijabs, and she continued to make waves from behind the bars, refusing to wear the chador, which is a tent-like head-to-toe cloth, while also going on intermittent hunger strikes. Now, last week, she was temporarily released on furlough to receive medical treatment, and all that and more has been depicted in a film, Nasrin. Let's take a look at a small clip of that documentary together.
Nasrin Sotoudeh is a prominent lawyer in Iran who's been fighting for children's rights, women's rights, and human rights.
She is one of the bravest voices in Iran.
She took on cases that other lawyers were too afraid to take on.
We've seen Nasrin Sotoudeh jailed for defending human rights.
It has cost her and her young family a lot.
Protesting against the law which forces Iranian women to wear the hijab. The country's most prominent human rights activist and a voice for the voiceless.
I'd like to welcome the husband and wife duo behind that project, which was 4 years in the making, Jeff Kaufman and Marcia. Thank you so much for joining us. Jeff, talk us through the work that went into filming this extraordinary documentary.
Well, we couldn't go to Iran ourselves because of previous work we've done, and also if you showed up with a large crew to follow Nasrin Sotoudeh around, it wouldn't be the most discreet way to have that kind of access. So we worked with immensely talented people in Iran who put themselves at great risk to film Nasrin, and in a remarkable variety of situations, at home, at work, with clients who were at risk themselves, and venturing into bookstores and art galleries and theaters. It was really an immersive process for us, long distance, and we hope for people who watch the film as well.
Now, Marcia, I want to talk to you about the film itself. It's as much about Nasrin as it is about human and women's rights in Iran.
Well, I have felt from the beginning that you really cannot talk about Nasrin's career as a human rights activist without starting with her work as in women's rights. I mean, that's where she began. The feminist movement in Iran is very powerful, and she was surrounded by a group of extraordinary women, and they all worked together, and this continued to lead her further into her legal career and the support of other people.
And that support continues. Jeff, as I mentioned earlier, Nasrin has been temporarily released on furlough. How much of an impact would you say that her husband's relentless campaigning, your film and general coverage of the story have had on this?
Well, first of all, I have to say that Reza Khan, her husband, who is a remarkable individual himself, was arrested soon after Nasrin was, and was held in prison for 3 months and is out on bail facing 6 years in prison. So he puts himself at risk every time he works on his wife's behalf. Reza has said over and over again that the key to protecting human rights activists in Iran and other countries is public pressure. Keep the public pressure on. So, we've seen a remarkable international group of people working together on behalf of Nasrin. This film is part of it. We're proud of that. And it's important to not stop now. Really, this is a time to keep pushing even harder.
And even Nasrin's not stopping. Marcia, you spoke to Nasrin, you speak to her. You've previously said that she actually really wanted this film to also focus on the plight of others inside the Islamic Republic.
Yes, I think that's an important point. She always speaks of other people. There's never a time when she's focused on herself. You know, even when she went on her first hunger strike in prison, in Evin prison, recently, there was this long second one, but the first one was because she was concerned about elderly prisoners, and that hunger strike helped get them out. And that is something you see over and over again. She said this to us so many times. I don't want this movie to be just about me. It's about many people and the work that many people do. And she really makes a point over and over again of never making it about herself.
And this film is about many people and many things. Jeff, lastly and briefly, for me, your documentary humanizes Iranians, it separates them from the regime, and you also zoom in on the country's heritage, arts, culture. It's beautiful.
Yes, that was always one of our goals and something we talked about with Nasrin. She passionately believes that the arts can push society forward, and so we could follow her into those aspects of Iran. We really wanted to show that the people are not the regime. That applies, by the way, to America and France as well. That there's a depth to the people that is well worth knowing, and we hope this film will be a way to open some barriers, to make some connections, and to hopefully push us closer together.
Here's hoping. Jeff Kaufman, Marcia, I'd like to thank you deeply for taking the time to speak to us about Nasrin, which is as fascinating as it is moving. That's it for us this week on Middle East Matters. Thank you all so much for watching. Do stay tuned.